My daughter-in-law slapped me outside court minutes later. I walked in as the judge's guest. I had barely made it up the courthouse steps when Rose's voice tore through the morning air, sharp enough to slice the breath straight out of my lungs. "You're nothing but a walking corpse, living off our money," she spat, her words echoing off the stone columns as if she wanted the entire city of Houston to hear her humiliation of me. God, I wish you'd just die already so I wouldn't have to babysit your useless, wrinkled hide. Do you even know how pathetic you look? I felt my fingers tremble against the railing, the old injury at the back of my skull prickling the way it always did when my memory faltered. Some days the world blurred in thin gaps, small pieces missing like pages torn from a book. But Rose's voice, vicious, bright, unrelenting, was impossible to forget. "Look at you," she hissed. "You don't even know where you're walking. You embarrass us every time you breathe, and you don't even have the dignity to feel ashamed." I tried to steady myself, tried to pull the edges of my thoughts together, but the noise of traffic and courthouse chatter wove into her shouting until everything felt like a tightening circle I couldn't step out of. When I lifted my eyes, Evan stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, staring at the ground. He didn't defend me. He didn't say a word. I remember thinking that if he could have disappeared into the concrete, he would have. Rose stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply, her face twisted with the kind of hatred that had long stopped surprising me. "Stop shaking like some pathetic stray. You're an adult, aren't you? Act like it for once in your miserable life." She shoved my shoulder as she said it, subtle enough that anyone passing might think it was accidental. But I felt the deliberate pressure behind her fingers, the warning directed only at me. She wanted me frightened. She wanted me unsteady. I tried to take a slow breath. I knew what happened the last time she shoved me. The fall, the blackness, the blank days afterward, where I didn't remember who had visited or what year it was, or why my pillow smelled faintly like hospital linen. That haze still clung to the back of my mind now, making everything tilt when I tried to focus too hard. "Move faster," Rose snapped. "The judge's time is worth more than your entire existence." And then she stepped directly behind me as I approached the top stair. I felt her presence before I felt her hand, fingers closing around my arm, tugging forward just sharply enough that my slippered foot slipped on the edge. I gasped and pitched forward, my balance cracking like thin ice, and before I could grab the railing, Rose's palm struck the side of my face. Not a shove, a slap. Hard enough that my vision burst white at the edges. I stumbled, catching myself against the cold metal rail with both hands. The pain bloomed across my cheek, hot and humiliating. "What did I tell you?" Rose snarled. "If you can't walk, don't make me drag you. You're not a child. You're just—" Her sentence was cut off, because something shifted behind her. A voice, steady, deep, crisp with authority, cut through the air like a blade drawn from its sheath. "That is enough." Rose froze. Her whole body stiffened, her painted smile collapsing into something flat and stunned. I blinked and turned my head slowly, still holding on to the railing as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. Judge Wynn stood at the top of the stairs, his long coat stirring in the breeze, his expression carved from still stone. He was not a tall man, not heavy, not imposing in a physical way, but his presence was. His gaze moved between Rose's hand still hanging midair and my reddening cheek. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but it carried through the courtyard like thunder that refused to raise its volume. "If you lay a finger on her again," he said, "I will have you arrested on the spot for assault and contempt of court." Rose's lips parted in stunned disbelief. Evan straightened, his face blanching. A security officer nearby slowed his steps, watching for Wynn's signal. People began to turn and stare, whispers rising like wind through dry grass. For a moment, everything went still. Inside me, something trembled, something old, something buried deep. I stared at Judge Wynn's face, trying to connect it to some fractured shadow in my memory, but the harder I tried, the more the images slipped away. Names, places, smiles blurred like watercolor left in the rain. He looked at me like he knew me well. A familiarity flickered in his eyes, one I desperately wished I could reach, like a door in my mind that remained locked from inside. But the injury that had rattled my mind months ago had taken pieces of my past I still couldn't retrieve. A familiarity flickered in his eyes, one I desperately wished I could reach, like a door in my mind that remained locked from inside. If you feel justice deserves celebration, smash that hype button. Let us keep stories like this alive, echoing far, far away. Your support helps us bring understanding and love to those who deserve it. Thank you so much. Keep listening. Judge Wynne stepped closer to me, not touching, but placing himself between Rose and the railing. Mrs. Antoinette, are you hurt? He asked. And there was an undertone there, gentle, protective, wrapped in something that felt like recognition, but I couldn't reach the memory it belonged to. I shook my head slowly, more uncertain than confident. His eyes softened for a heartbeat, then hardened again as he turned toward the clerk who had followed him out. Take her inside, he instructed calmly. Now. She'll wait in my private conference room. Yes, Your Honor. Rose's mouth twisted. You can't just... Wynne lifted one eyebrow, a tiny motion that carried a warning. Rose finally understood. She snapped her jaw closed, her face paling back to the shade it held when she lied or when someone with true authority stood in her way. Evan lowered his eyes to the ground. For one fleeting second, I saw something like shame flicker across his face. The clerk guided me gently toward the glass doors. Behind me, Rose sputtered under her breath, blocked from following, blocked from controlling the next minutes of my life for the first time in years. As the doors closed behind me with a soft, final click, I felt the world shift, not violently, not suddenly, but with the quiet certainty that everything that came next would no longer belong to Rose's control. I didn't know why Judge Wynne had stepped in. I didn't know why he had looked at me with familiarity. I didn't know what part of my past had slipped beyond my injured memory. But I knew one thing clearly. Something she never expected had just begun. I have lived long enough to learn that hatred rarely begins with a single moment. It grows the way cracks spread through old porcelain, slow and invisible, until suddenly everything shatters and people swear it happened all at once. Evan did not begin life resenting me. He was a quiet child, gentle, sensitive, the kind of boy who cried when I left for work, but always waited by the window until I came home. The change began with his father, long before Rose sharpened it into something deadly. My husband used to say things in a casual tone that never felt casual. Your mother loves her patients more than she loves you, he would tell Evan when I worked late shifts at the hospital. Look at her always running after strangers while you sit here waiting. He said it with a bitter smile, one he thought Evan couldn't understand, but children understand more than adults ever admit. I came home exhausted from saving someone's life, but what my son heard was that I chose strangers over him, and eventually he believed it. The cruelest part is that Evan doesn't remember the day I saved him. He remembers only the embarrassment, not the terror. He had been playing with two boys from the neighborhood, daring each other to cross the street without looking. When he stepped out in front of a truck, I saw it before anyone mothers always do. I ran, grabbed him by the collar, yanked him back so hard we both fell onto the sidewalk. My heart was pounding so violently I could taste metal on my tongue, but his friends were watching, and panic came out as anger. I scolded him for crossing without checking, my voice too sharp, too loud. I held him afterward, I remember that part, but what stayed with him was the humiliation, not the rescue. In his memory, I yelled at him in front of his friends. The truck, the near death, the shaking hands, all erased. As he grew, so did the distortions. My night shifts, which paid for his textbooks and his summer science camps, became proof that Mom was never around. My exhaustion became, Mom doesn't care enough to try. His father fed those thoughts like dry wood into a fire he never intended to put out. And then Rose stepped into his life. From the beginning, she assessed me the way people inspect a house they might want to demolish, noting the weaknesses, the places she could break without leaving obvious cracks. She was beautiful, ambitious, and angry in the way people become when they feel the world owes them more than they've earned. She studied Evan with hungry eyes and discovered the insecurity his father had planted years before. Once she found it, she watered it every single day. "She works as a nurse because she failed at everything else," Rose would whisper to him, just loud enough for me to hear, but soft enough for Evan to think she was only venting. "Your mother is drowning you. You could have your own house if she wasn't clinging to life out of spite." "She's poor, Evan, poor and old. If she passed on, we could finally start living." Rose didn't hate me for things I had done. She hated me for the things I refused to give her. I had no idea then that saying no was enough to make me her enemy forever. A few months later, she asked to borrow money for a cosmetic procedure, a nose surgery she claimed she deserved after all the stress I put her through. I didn't have the savings, and even if I did, I wasn't going to fund her vanity. She carried that refusal like a burning coal she never put down. But the moment that sealed her hatred, the one she brought up again and again afterward, was the day Evan threw a rock through the neighbor's window. I marched him over to apologize, made him admit his mistake. Rose later pulled me aside and hissed, "You humiliated him. A real mother protects her son. You just love making him look weak." I tried to explain that accountability was love. She walked away before I finished the sentence. Over time, those seeds became a forest of resentment. And then came the fall. When I woke up, days had been carved out of my mind like pages torn from a diary. Rose told Evan I slipped. Evan believed her. I forgot the truth. In the end, the cruelty didn't begin with a slap outside the courthouse. It began with the small, deliberate ways my history was rewritten, until my own son saw me not as his mother, but as the obstacle Rose convinced him I was. And I didn't remember any of it until the day someone finally protected me again. I used to think the worst humiliation in my life was behind me the day Rose slapped me on those courthouse steps, but as I stood inside the hallway waiting for Judge Wynn's clerk to return, I could hear the noise from outside, the sound of people laughing. Laughter always travels farther when it's aimed at someone who's already wounded. Through the thin glass of the courthouse door, I saw Rose standing with a small cluster of her friends, her arms crossed, her smile wide and vicious. She tossed her hair back the way she always did when she wanted attention, and her voice carried like a knife sliding under a door. "She's practically brain dead at this point," Rose bragged. "Getting her to hand over the house is going to be easier than teaching a dog to sit." Her friends laughed, loud enough that some of the attorneys walking by turned to stare. One of them, a woman in a red blazer, snorted and said, "Honestly, Rose, that old hag should have broken her neck the last time she fell. Would have saved you the trouble." Another chimed in, "Imagine still being alive just to be a burden. Couldn't be me." I felt a coldness crawl up the back of my neck. But those memories didn't stay steady. They flickered like a faulty light, leaving me unsure what was real and what my mind filled in on its own. I tried to focus, tried to breathe, but voices echoed again, this time Evan's. He wasn't laughing like Rose's friends. He stood apart, leaning against the stone column outside the courthouse, speaking to a man I didn't recognize. His face was tight, his posture defensive, the way he always looked when he wanted sympathy without admitting guilt. "It's constant," Evan complained. "She forgets everything. She wanders. She costs money we don't have. People act like I'm the bad guy, but she's the one making life hell for me and Rose." The man nodded sympathetically, and Evan shook his head, lowering his voice even though I could still read his lips through the window. "If she would just stop dragging things out, maybe Rose and I could finally move on." Move on. From what? From me? From the life I gave him? From the woman who worked herself sick so he could have shoes, books, braces, and every single chance his father never provided? My chest tightened. I touched the side of my temple, the place where the slap still burned. I didn't understand how resentment could grow this large, or how blindness could last this long. And then Avery Cross appeared around the corner. Avery had lived next door to us for years. Younger than me by decades, but kind in a way people rarely are anymore. She had brought soup when I was sick, helped me carry groceries when Evan didn't come to the door, and once patched a scrape on my knee after I tripped on the back step. She always noticed things, even when she pretended she didn't. She saw the commotion outside the courthouse, and her eyes narrowed. She walked straight toward me, slipping inside the hallway through the side door. Her voice was low when she spoke. "Are you all right?" I nodded, though we both knew it wasn't true. Her gaze flicked toward the bruise rising beneath my eye. She hesitated, then reached into her purse. "I didn't know if I should show you this," she whispered, "but I think you'll need it." She handed me her phone. On the screen were photos grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. Rose standing over me in the backyard weeks ago, yelling, one hand gripping my shoulder. Another photo captured her shoving me as I reached for the laundry basket. A third showed me on the ground, clutching my arm, while Rose walked away, unfazed. "I heard you cry for help that day," Avery said softly. "But by the time I reached the fence, Evan was telling you to stop making a scene. I took photos because something felt wrong." My breath trembled. I didn't know whether to thank her or collapse. As I lowered the phone, something slipped from my purse, a small, folded piece of paper I didn't remember writing. I blinked, picked it up, and unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was my own. "Don't let me forget the time she pushed me." The ink was wobbly, as if written with shaking hands. At the bottom, smeared but legible, were 3 more words. "She'll do it again." My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I didn't remember writing that note. But something inside me, the part that survived every fall, every insult, every shove disguised as an accident, knew it was the truth. And for the first time, I wondered if forgetting was the only thing keeping me alive. When Judge Wynn asked me to sit, his expression was steady. But there was something else beneath it, concern. Yes, but also a quiet recognition that unsettled me. I still couldn't place where I knew him from, and the gap in my memory throbbed like a bruise, making everything feel further away than it should have been. He folded his hands on the table and said gently, "Mrs. Antoinette, if there is anything you want the court to know before your hearing begins, now is the time to speak." His voice was calm, but I felt its weight press against the shaky corners of my mind. I reached into my purse with hands that trembled more from fear than age. I took out the small, worn notebook I hadn't dared to show anyone. I placed it on the table, its cover cracked, its pages dog-eared from years of being opened and closed in secret. I don't know if any of this will make sense," I said, "because I don't remember writing some of it. But I know it's mine." Judge Wynn nodded once, encouraging, and I opened the diary. The handwriting was uneven, shaky like someone fighting through fog, but the words carved themselves into the air between us. I read pieces aloud because my voice needed to hear them as much as he did. One line read, "She pushed me near the porch. I don't remember falling. I remember her smile." Another, "I heard Evan say it's better if I forget. I don't understand what I am forgetting." Another page, the ink distressed as if the pen had been pressed too hard, said, "She wants the house. They talk about it when they think I sleep. I pretend to sleep." Judge Wynn's brows tightened. He didn't interrupt. I turned to a page I didn't recall writing at all. "If I forget everything, please let someone believe I was telling the truth. Someone has to remember for me." My throat tightened painfully. He reached for the notebook, not snatching it, but receiving it like something fragile he had the duty to protect. As he skimmed the entries, his jaw shifted subtly, and the softness in his eyes thinned into something sharper. I wasn't done. "There's something else," I whispered. I took out the old phone, the one my husband had set up years before he passed. He always worried about me being alone, so he installed an automatic recording function. It turned on whenever the microphone detected raised voices. I had forgotten that feature existed until I found the phone buried under blankets in my drawer 2 nights earlier. The screen was cracked, the battery weak, but the recordings were still there. I placed it in front of Judge Wynn. It recorded things, arguments, moments I didn't even know were being saved. He unlocked the file list, then looked at me silently, asking permission. I nodded. He pressed play on the first recording. Rose's voice burst out sharply. "You think I'm going to wait forever? Just sign the damn house over and stop dragging out your miserable life." The judge's face didn't move, but something in the room did. The air felt different, heavier, as if the walls themselves stiffened. Another clip clicked on. Evan's voice, lower but unmistakable, said, "If she falls again, it'll solve everything. She's old. Falls happen." I closed my eyes. I didn't remember that conversation, but hearing it confirmed something deep inside me that I had been trying to reason away. Another recording began. Rose hissed through clenched teeth. "One little push on the stairs. Just one. She won't even know what happened." Judge Wynn paused the playback slowly, deliberately, as though he needed a moment to keep his expression controlled. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose, the sound quiet but sharp. "Mrs. Antoinette," he said, "did you show any of this to anyone else before today?" I shook my head. "I found the phone by accident. I don't even know how long it's been recording. I didn't know if it meant anything." "It means a great deal," he said, and for the first time there was no gentleness in his tone, only resolve. He lifted the diary again, flipping through pages he had not yet seen. When he looked up, his eyes had changed completely. The mild concern was gone. In its place was a cold, judicial focus, one that belonged not to a friend I had forgotten, but to a man who had just realized the elderly woman in front of him might not be safe at home for reasons far darker than memory loss. "This is no longer a family disagreement," he said quietly. "This is something else entirely." And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like someone finally believed me, even the parts of me I could no longer remember. Judge Wynn asked his clerk to escort me into a smaller conference room behind the courtroom, a quiet space with dim lighting and walls covered in framed certificates I couldn't focus on. I followed slowly, my steps careful, my mind clouded with the same haze that had taken hold ever since the fall that damaged my memory. Wynn closed the door behind us and sat across from me, the distance between us feeling both too small and impossibly wide. There was a look in his eyes, a mixture of recognition and sorrow, that made something inside me twist even though I couldn't place him in any memory I still possessed. "Mrs. Antoinette," he said, lowering his voice, "I need you to answer me honestly. Have you ever been pushed, shoved, or forced into a fall by anyone you live with?" His words cut gently but deeply, as though he already feared the truth. I opened my mouth, but all that came out was a fractured breath. I don't remember everything," I said. "Sometimes I see pieces, but they don't stay long." His jaw tightened, not in frustration at me, but as though he were restraining anger on my behalf. "You wrote in your diary that someone pushed you," he reminded me. "Do you believe that was real?" I swallowed hard. "I believe something happened," I whispered. But I never knew who to trust about it, not even myself. Wynn exhaled slowly, then stood. "Stay here," he said, and the firmness in his tone felt like a wall rising between me and the world outside. Minutes later, the door opened sharply, and Evan and Rose were escorted in. Rose walked with her arms folded tightly across her chest, her chin raised in practiced arrogance. Evan looked pale, glancing everywhere except at me. Wynn didn't sit this time. He stood at the end of the table, his presence filling the room with an authority that overshadowed all of us. "I have questions," he said, "and both of you will answer directly." Rose scoffed, but Wynn didn't give her space to speak. "First," he said, "why does the power of attorney filed under your names contain a signature that matches a scanned image rather than an in-person signature?" The forensic technician already flagged it. Evan blinked, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Rose jumped in first. "She probably forgot she signed it," she snapped. "She forgets everything." Wynn's glare cut her off so sharply her voice died mid-sentence. He continued, "Second, a neighbor's outdoor camera captured multiple instances of yelling and demeaning behavior directed at Mrs. Antoinette. Why were you screaming at her on at least 6 documented dates?" Rose's face drained of color. "She's old," she snapped. "She needs to be told what to do, or she'll mess up the entire house." "That's not abuse. That's structure." Wynn's expression hardened further. "And third," he said, "why did you not report any of her falls to a hospital or primary care physician?" "The pattern is suspiciously consistent," Evan finally spoke, his voice weak. She said she was fine, he muttered. She exaggerates pain. Wynne took a step forward, and his voice became colder than anything I had ever heard from him. She had a head injury, resulting in memory loss. That is never fine. You were legally obligated to report it. Rose's composure began to fracture. She kept shifting her weight, her fingers twitching, her eyes darting toward Evan as if begging him to rescue her. "This is ridiculous," she hissed. "She's confused. She's always confused. She makes up things. You can't trust a single word that woman says." She pointed at me as though I were a defective object she wanted returned. "She's trying to ruin us because she likes playing the victim." Wynne slammed a folder on the table, not violently, but decisively enough that the sound made Rose flinch. "Enough," he said. "Mrs. Antoinette may forget events due to trauma. That does not invalidate the evidence." Then came the moment I hadn't expected, the moment everything shifted. Wynne straightened, his posture tall and unwavering, and said, "Given the contents of the diary, the recovered recordings, and your behavior at the courthouse steps this morning, this court will open a formal investigation into elder abuse, coercion, and potential financial exploitation." Rose opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Evan dropped his gaze to the floor. "This is not optional," Wynne continued. "Until the investigation concludes, Mrs. Antoinette will not return to your home. She will be placed under temporary protective supervision." Rose's face contorted with fury, her composure disintegrating completely. "You can't do this! She's lying! She's manipulating you!" Wynne looked at her with a coldness that left no room for argument. "If you raise your voice again," he said, "I will hold you in contempt of court and have you removed immediately." And for the first time since my memory began failing me, I felt something sharp and bright inside my chest. Safety. The courtroom felt colder than the hallway outside, a kind of cold that settled into my bones, even though the air wasn't actually chilly. Judge Wynne instructed the bailiff to seat me near the witness stand, but he didn't call on me yet. Instead, he said, "Before we proceed, the court will review newly submitted evidence." His voice carried a weight that made the room fall into immediate silence. I folded my hands together, tightening them in my lap as though they were the only solid thing keeping me steady. Rose sat across the aisle, her ankles crossed, her jaw clenched so tightly the muscles pulsed along her cheek. Evan kept his gaze fixed on the floor. I could see his knees bouncing restlessly. They didn't look like a married couple anymore, but like two people waiting for the ground to open and swallow them. Then the courtroom door opened. Avery Cross stepped inside. Her presence was quiet but firm, the kind of presence that did not need noise to be felt. She carried a simple brown envelope pressed against her chest as she approached the clerk's desk. Rose's lips parted first in confusion, then in recognition, and finally in dread. Wynne gestured for Avery to take the stand. Avery lifted her right hand, swore in, and sat down. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied with every sentence. "I live next door to Mrs. Antoinette," she said. "I've heard things, seen things I didn't understand at first." The clerk passed the envelope to Wynne. He opened it, eyes scanning each photograph with slow precision. Then he held the first one up, a clear image of Rose leaning over me at the backyard fence, her mouth twisted in a scream while my face looked small and frightened. Rose shot to her feet. That was taken out of context. "Sit down, Mrs. Whitcomb," Wynne commanded, and she dropped back into her chair as though the words had weight. A second photograph was displayed, Evan standing at the kitchen doorway, arms folded, while I lay on the tile after one of my accidents. He made no move to help in the picture. His expression was empty, indifferent. A murmur rolled through the courtroom. Avery continued, voice cracking. "There were nights I heard her call out for help. I knocked on the door, but they never let me in. Once I saw Mrs. Antoinette try to climb the porch step and fall backward." Rose laughed. Evan walked inside. My chest tightened so sharply I had to grip the arms of my chair. Wynne leaned forward. "Why didn't you report this sooner?" Avery swallowed. "She always told me she was fine, and I thought Maybe it wasn't my place. But then she started looking, afraid. She blinked fast. So, when I heard shouting this morning, I followed her to the courthouse. Rose muttered under her breath, "Stupid, meddling bitch." Wynne heard it. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he warned, "you are making this far worse for yourself." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of power shift away from the people who had controlled my life and toward the truth. Wynne set the photos down and picked up the diary I had turned in earlier. Its pages were worn and creased. The handwriting slanted unevenly from the tremor in my hands during those months I could barely remember. He cleared his throat. "These entries," he said, "were written before Mrs. Antoinette's memory loss." He began reading. "March 12, I heard them whispering about selling the house once I'm gone." "I don't know what that means." Evan's head snapped up. His lips parted as if he wanted to object, but nothing came out. Wynne read another. "April 2, I feel dizzy again. Rose said it's normal for old people. But I saw her watching the stairs as I climbed." Rose crossed her arms, staring straight ahead, refusing to react. Then Wynne's voice softened, but the softness made every syllable cut deeper. "May 19. I think they want me dead. I don't want to believe it, but the way they talk when they think I cannot hear, it scares me." A hush fell across the courtroom, so complete I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Evan's shoulders folded inward. It wasn't just guilt, it was the slow, painful comprehension of a man who finally recognized every warning he once ignored. He began to realize that the truth had been living beside him for years, waiting for the courage he never offered. His hands came to his face, fingers digging into his forehead as though he wanted to tear something out from behind his eyes. Whatever bravado he had, left drained away. Wynne nodded to the technician. A small speaker was placed on the table. "We will now listen to the audio recovered from the old device." Rose surged up. "This is outrageous! That old phone is broken!" "Silence," Wynne said, and her voice died mid-protest. The first recording clicked on. My voice trembled faintly in the background, followed immediately by Rose's voice, sharp, venomous, unmistakable. "I swear, just one more fall, and this whole mess will sort itself out." Someone gasped in the back of the courtroom. Another recording followed, Evan's voice lower, hesitant but complicit. "Maybe we should wait until after the refinance clears. Then it won't look planned." I felt my stomach twist so hard I thought I might collapse. But the worst was Rose's final recording. "Old woman needs to die already." The courtroom didn't just fall silent, it recoiled, as if her words carried a stench everyone suddenly smelled at once. "She's nothing but dead weight." The courtroom didn't just fall silent, it recoiled, as if her words carried a stench everyone suddenly smelled at once. The room fell into a stunned, horrified silence. Wynne straightened, expression carved into stone. "Bailiff, take Mrs. Rose Whitcomb into custody effective immediately, on suspicion of elder abuse, attempted coercion, and endangerment." Rose screamed as two officers seized her arms, her heels scraping wildly against the polished floor. Evan didn't look at her. He was crying quietly, brokenly, the way a child cries when he realizes he was led into darkness by someone he trusted more than the truth. And for the first time, he looked at me not with anger, not with annoyance, but with the shattered realization of a man waking from a long nightmare he helped create. After Rose was dragged out of the courtroom, kicking and cursing and still trying to twist herself into the role of the victim, the silence she left behind was almost heavier than her voice had been. I sat there with my hands folded, feeling the tremble finally leave my fingers, as though my body was realizing it no longer had to brace for another blow. Justice was slow, yes, but at least it had finally found its way to the right doorstep. The days that followed were a blur of hearings, interviews, filings, and statements. Yet every step of the legal process felt strangely steady beneath my feet, as if I were walking on solid ground for the first time in years. Rose's charges multiplied once investigators reviewed all evidence: elder abuse, attempted assault, financial coercion, document forgery, and reckless endangerment. The district attorney added an enhancement because I was considered a vulnerable adult under Texas law. When the sentencing finally came, she stood in court wearing a cheap gray jumpsuit, her hair uncoiled, her face drawn and tight from sleepless nights in the county jail. She didn't look like the woman who once slapped me with manicured nails or who strutted through the house as though the walls themselves bowed for her. The judge read the sentence in an even voice. 18 to 25 years in state prison, depending on her behavior and cooperation. Rose's knees almost buckled. She screamed my name like a curse, shouting that I had ruined her life. I simply looked back at her with the calm I had earned through suffering and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Those years were not stolen from her. She had carved them out herself. Her parental rights, if she ever had any intention of being a mother, were terminated within the month. And when she was led away in handcuffs, she did not look like a villain anymore. She looked like a small, furious shadow who finally ran out of darkness to hide behind. My son's consequences came differently. He did not go to prison. The prosecution recognized that Rose was the mastermind, the one who manipulated, threatened, and filled his head with promises of a future built on my absence. But manipulation does not excuse participation, and Evan had participated by silence, by indifference, by convenience. He received 3 years of community supervision, mandatory counseling, and 200 hours of community service in a senior care program. The irony was cruel but fitting. He tried to speak to me after the sentencing, but for the first time in my life, I realized I had no obligation to soothe the pain he had created. He cried a quiet, stuttering cry that made him look like the little boy I once rescued from the street all those years ago. He apologized, over and over, but every apology felt like water poured over ashes, too late to revive what had burned. He also lost every legal claim to my estate. Wynne made sure my revised documents were ironclad. The house, the savings, everything I had built, all of it was protected from him. I could see the acceptance settle slowly over his face, like a man finally understanding that consequences are not the same as cruelty. He told me he hoped someday I would forgive him. I told him forgiveness wasn't impossible, but reconciliation was no longer on the table. Some things you survive, some things you outgrow, and some things you walk away from forever. Avery stayed by my side through every meeting, every hearing, every doctor visit. She brought casseroles, blankets, and the gentle reassurance of someone who understood what it meant to be frightened and alone. Her presence became a kind of warmth I didn't know I had been starving for. Judge Wynne helped me navigate everything else: housing, financial protections, medical follow-ups. He moved with the quiet steadiness of a man who believed he had failed me once and refused to fail me again. He insisted on checking in personally until I was fully settled, never crossing boundaries, only protecting what he called a debt of childhood friendship. For the first time in years, I felt held, not by obligation, not by blood, but by choice. That, I realized, is the truest form of family. And as Rose sat behind bars and Evan swept the floors of a nursing home on weekends, I finally breathed a full breath, without fear, without hesitation, without looking over my shoulder. Justice had arrived. And it stayed. When everything was finally over, the hearings, the statements, the sentencing, the apologies spoken too late, I found myself sitting at my kitchen table with a pen in my hand and a stack of legal documents in front of me. There was no trembling this time, no confusion flickering in and out of my memory, just quiet certainty. For the first time in decades, I was rewriting the story of my life on my own terms. I began with my will. The house I had worked for, bled for, sacrificed for, I left it to Avery. It wasn't simply gratitude for her courage. It was recognition. She had protected me when my own family would have gladly watched me fall. Kindness like that deserved a legacy. A significant portion of my savings went to a local shelter for abused women, many of them mothers and grandmothers who had been silenced by the very people who were supposed to protect them. I wanted them to have a refuge stronger than the fear that chased them. And then I reached Evan's name. I did not cross it out in anger. I crossed it out with steadiness, with truth, with the understanding that love without respect is not love, it is captivity. When I wrote the words, "He shall receive nothing," they carried no bitterness, only release. As I signed the final page, a soft knock sounded at my door. Judge Wynne stepped inside with a gentle nod, holding an envelope I didn't recognize. There was something in his eyes, an old, familiar warmth that my mind had been too broken to see before. "I found something," he said, setting the envelope in front of me. "Thought you might want it back." Inside were 3 photographs, 2 children standing in a field of summer grass, holding fishing rods twice their height, grinning with missing teeth. Me and Wynne, 12 years old, sunburned, and inseparable. The memories hit me like a wave breaking across rock, sudden, powerful, unstoppable. I gripped the edge of the table as images poured back into place, laughing at the creek, sharing sandwiches, racing bicycles down dusty back roads, promising we'd never lose each other. And then I remembered the accident, the shove, the fall, the ringing in my skull, the strange fog that swallowed whole pieces of my life, the ache of forgetting someone who once felt like a piece of my own soul. Tears blurred the photograph. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I didn't remember you." Wynne shook his head softly. "You survived. That's enough." He placed a hand over mine, steady and warm, and for the first time, in many years, I felt safe in a way that didn't depend on fear disappearing but on goodness staying. A week later, I moved into a small cottage on the quieter side of Houston, a modest place with pale blue shutters and a porch swing that creaked like it had stories of its own. It wasn't grand, but it was mine, wholly mine, without shadows in the hallways or insults echoing through thin walls. Avery visited every other day, carrying groceries or gossip, or simply the warmth of someone who cared, because it was her nature. Wynne came often too, sometimes to check on me, sometimes to talk about nothing in particular, sometimes just to sit on the porch and breathe the quiet evening air with me like we used to on childhood summer nights. In that small cottage, I discovered a kind of peace that didn't feel fragile or borrowed. It felt earned. I planted herbs in the backyard, hung lace curtains in the kitchen, and learned to sleep without waiting for footsteps outside my door. I cooked what I wanted, watched old movies, and called Avery whenever I burned something, which was more often than I cared to admit. And little by little, the fear that had once lived in my bones began to dissolve, replaced by something lighter, something steady, something alive. One evening, as the sky turned gold and the cicadas started their nightly chorus, I sat on my porch swing and let my hands rest quietly in my lap. I thought of the courthouse steps, of Rose's slap, of Evan's silence, of the years I spent believing I was walking toward the end of my life. I thought of the fall that nearly killed me, the lies they fed each other, the plan they made over coffee and convenience. And then I thought of now, of Avery's laughter drifting from the kitchen window, of Wynne bringing me lemon bars because he insisted mine were criminally bland, of the warm breeze brushing across my cheek like the softest reminder that I had come out the other side. My voice was steady when I finally spoke into the quiet dusk. They thought pushing me down the steps would end my life. But I stood back up, and they're the ones who fell into the hole they dug. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the swing move gently beneath me. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel old. I felt as if the years they tried to steal from me were quietly returning, settling back into the places they belonged. I didn't feel afraid. I felt free. And freedom, I realized, was the sweetest ending of all. Thank you, dear listener, for staying with me until the end of this journey. Stories like mine are not just about pain, they're about rising after the fall, reclaiming the pieces of ourselves that others tried to break, and remembering that no grandmother, no elder, no human being deserves to be treated as disposable. If this story touched your heart, if it made you angry for the right reasons, if it reminded you that justice can still shine through even the darkest moments, then I hope you'll stay close. Please subscribe to Grandma True Stories, where voices like mine are finally heard, honored, and protected. Your support helps keep these stories alive, stories of strength, survival, and the quiet courage of grandmothers everywhere who refuse to be erased. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself, and take care of the elders who once took care of you.